So my daughter came up to me, tears streaming down her face, and said, "Dad, Mom wants to send me to an orphanage." But as it turns out, that wasn't the worst thing my wife had done. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, like a steady drumbeat against the quiet of the house. Justin Duncan sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by scattered papers and the soft hum of his laptop. As a history teacher at Eastwood High, he was accustomed to the routine of grading essays about events like the Revolutionary War or the fall of the Berlin Wall. But today, the silence felt heavier than usual. His wife, Megan, had left for her weekly book club meeting, or at least that's what she had said. Their 10-year-old daughter, Laura, was still at school. For once, Justin found himself alone with his thoughts. His eyes drifted to his phone, where a photo of his family lit up the lock screen. Laura was smiling wide, her front teeth just beginning to grow back, while Megan leaned against his shoulder, glowing in the warm light of a summer sunset. A tight knot formed in his chest. Lately, something felt off. Megan's smile seemed brighter around strangers, but dimmer at home. She had been distracted, always glued to her phone, her excuses for late nights growing vaguer with time. Justin shook his head, trying to dismiss the thoughts. Megan was an independent person. Maybe he was just overanalyzing things. A sudden creak at the front door pulled him from his thoughts. Justin frowned. It was too early for school to be out. Rising from his chair, he stepped into the hallway. "Laura?" he called out, expecting silence. Instead, a small voice answered, "It's me, Dad." Something in her tone made him pause. She sounded upset, like she was holding back tears. Laura appeared in the hallway, her pink backpack hanging loosely from her shoulders and her cheeks flushed. Justin crouched down to her level, concern written all over his face. "Hey, kiddo," he said softly. "What's wrong? Why are you home so early?" She hesitated, her small fingers fiddling with the straps of her backpack, her eyes fixed on the floor. "There was a substitute today," she mumbled. "They let us out after lunch because of an emergency." Justin nodded slowly, sensing there was more to her story. "Okay, but something else is bothering you. What happened?" Laura's lip trembled as she finally lifted her gaze to meet his. Her tearful eyes looked so much like Megan's that it stung. "I don't want to get in trouble," she whispered. "You're not in trouble, sweetheart," Justin reassured her. "You can tell me anything." Her shoulders slumped, and she glanced nervously toward the stairs before leaning closer to him. She lowered her voice, as if someone might overhear. "Yesterday, I came home early like today," she said quietly. "I went upstairs to your room." Justin felt his breath catch, but he stayed silent, letting her continue. Her words tumbled out quickly now, barely above a whisper. "The door wasn't locked, so I went in. I saw Mom with a man. They were doing weird stuff." Justin froze. Those words echoed in his mind, looping endlessly. "What kind of weird stuff, Laura?" he asked gently, though his voice trembled slightly. Laura flushed, her face growing red. "They were hugging and kissing. She didn't see me at first, but when she did, she got really mad. Dad." Her voice cracked, and she clutched his arm tightly. "She said if I ever told you, she'd send me to an orphanage." Justin pulled her into a firm hug, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel her trembling in his arms, as fragile as a leaf caught in a storm. Anger bubbled inside him, not at Laura, but at Megan, the woman he had trusted, the woman he had built his life with. A bitter taste of betrayal filled his mouth. "You are not going anywhere," Justin said firmly. "I promise. You're my daughter, and you'll always stay with me." Laura sniffled against his shoulder. "Do you believe me?" Justin gently cupped her face, wiping away her tears. "I believe you, Laura. Every word." As she clung to him, Justin felt a cold determination settle over him. 15 years of trust and love with Megan now felt like a cruel illusion. But the infidelity wasn't the worst part. What hurt the most was the cruelty Megan had shown their daughter. A plan began to form in his mind. "Why don't you pack a few things for a sleepover at Beatrix's house?" he suggested gently. Beatrix was Laura's best friend, and her family was reliable and kind. You can stay there while I sort some things out. Laura hesitated, then nodded. Justin watched as she went upstairs, her steps lighter now that she had shared her burden. When she returned with her overnight bag, he drove her to Beatrix's house, masking the turmoil inside him with a calm demeanor. Laura waved goodbye, her smile brighter than it had been earlier. Justin stayed in the car for a long time after dropping her off, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The image of Megan with another man played over and over in his mind. His home, once a place of love and comfort, now felt tainted, a facade hiding betrayal and lies. He couldn't face it without addressing the truth. Later that evening, Justin stood in the backyard, staring at a pile of Megan's belongings. Her clothes, keepsakes, even her favorite books. All of it. He struck a match, the tiny flame dancing in his hand before catching on the pile. The fire consumed everything quickly, its orange and red hues lighting up the night. As the smoke curled into the dark sky, Justin felt no sadness, only a cold satisfaction. The sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the silence. Megan's car pulled into the driveway, her headlights momentarily illuminating the yard. She stepped out, her heels clicking on the pavement. She froze when she saw the fire. "Justin?" she called uncertainly. "What's going on?" Justin turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "It's over, Megan," he said calmly. She paled, her eyes darting between him and the flames. What do you mean?" Justin took a step forward, his voice steady but sharp. "I know, Megan. I know everything." Her face crumpled, and she swayed on her feet before collapsing to the ground in a faint. Justin didn't move to catch her. He simply stood there, silhouetted against the fire, his eyes as stormy as his heart. When Megan regained consciousness, the acrid smell of smoke filled her nose. She sat up slowly, disoriented, and her eyes widened as she saw the smoldering pile of her belongings. Her dresses, photo albums, and cherished books, all reduced to ash. "What have you done?" she cried, her voice shaking. Justin stood silently a few feet away, his arms crossed. He didn't answer. His silence spoke volumes. His usually kind eyes burned with anger, and his expression made her stomach churn. Megan staggered to her feet, brushing dirt from her dress. "Justin, stop this madness. Why are you doing this?" "You know why," he replied coldly. "Don't act innocent." Megan's heart raced as she searched for words, anything to stop the storm brewing between them. Her voice trembled as she asked, "Where is Laura?" Without waiting for an answer, she ran toward the house, panic overtaking her. She threw open the door and stumbled inside, calling out frantically, "Laura? Where are you, sweetheart?" "It's okay. Mommy's here." The house was eerily quiet. As if it too were holding its breath, Megan's footsteps echoed down the hall as she hurriedly searched every room, her calls growing more frantic with each passing second. When she reached Laura's bedroom, the sight stopped her cold. The room was immaculate, the bed neatly made, and Laura's favorite stuffed bear sat propped against the pillow, staring back at her like a silent witness. "Justin!" Megan screamed, spinning on her heel. "What have you done with her?" She stormed downstairs, her eyes blazing as she came face to face with Justin. He stood in the dim light of the entryway, his tall frame blocking her path to the door. His face was calm, almost eerily so, but his clenched fists and rigid posture betrayed his anger. "Laura is safe," he said, his voice cold and unyielding. "She's with people who actually care about her, people who don't manipulate and threaten her." Megan's knees weakened as the weight of his words sank in. Her voice wavered. "What are you talking about? She's my daughter. She belongs with me." "Belongs with you?" Justin's voice rose sharply, his calm cracking like ice under pressure. "You think someone who threatens her own child with an orphanage deserves to raise her?" Megan's mouth opened, but no words came out. Her thoughts raced, trying to comprehend the accusation. Finally, she whispered, "She told you." "Of course she told me," Justin roared, his voice reverberating through the house. She's 10 years old, Megan. 10. And you scared her so badly she couldn't even come home yesterday. What kind of mother does that? Tears began to stream down Megan's face. I didn't mean it like that, she stammered. I panicked. I didn't know what else to do to keep her quiet. Justin laughed bitterly, a harsh, joyless sound. That's your excuse? Panic? You had months to come clean, to admit your lies. Instead, you dragged our daughter into your mess. Justin, please, she sobbed, her voice breaking. You have to believe me. I never meant to hurt anyone. Justin stepped closer, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper. You never meant to hurt anyone? You betrayed me, Megan. You broke our vows. You threatened our daughter. And for what? Some fling with some random man? It wasn't like that. Megan cried, desperation lacing her voice. It wasn't meaningless. Oh, Justin sneered, his tone dripping with sarcasm. So it was serious then? That makes it so much better. Megan's legs buckled, and she gripped the wall to steady herself. The enormity of the situation pressed down on her like a crushing weight. She reached for him, her hands trembling. Justin, I'm sorry. Please, let's talk about this. We can fix it. Justin recoiled as if her touch burned him, his expression hard and unforgiving. There is no fixing this, he said, his voice cold. You made your choice. Now you live with the consequences. Megan's panic deepened. Her mind scrambled for a solution, a way to regain control. Her eyes darted to her phone, still on the kitchen counter where she'd dropped it earlier. Without thinking, she lunged for it, snatching it up and dialing frantically. What are you doing? Justin demanded, suspicion lacing his voice. Megan held the phone to her ear, her hands shaking. You've lost your mind, Justin. I'm calling the police. For a moment he looked surprised. Then, a bitter smile crossed his face. Go ahead, he said quietly. Call them. But you'd better tell them the whole story about how you destroyed this family. The line connected, and Megan's voice quivered as she spoke. Hello? Yes, I need help. My husband he's burning my things and threatening me. Please, send someone quickly. Justin's piercing gaze stayed locked on hers as she gave the address. When she ended the call, the room seemed to hum with tension, the air heavy with unspoken words. You think calling the cops will save you? Justin said, his voice low and venomous. You think they'll listen to your lies and make you the victim? Just wait until they hear why I did this. Megan swallowed hard, clutching the phone like a lifeline. They'll protect me, she whispered, though her voice trembled with doubt. Justin took a step closer, his shadow towering over her. We'll see about that. The sound of approaching sirens sliced through the tense silence, growing louder with every second. Megan backed away, her heart racing as red and blue lights flickered across the windows. For a brief moment, Justin's expression flickered. Fear, perhaps, but it vanished just as quickly. He stepped back, his face cold and resolved. This isn't over, Megan, he said, his voice steady. Not by a long shot. The front door burst open, and 2 officers entered, their presence bringing a momentary surge of relief to Megan. But beneath her relief was a lingering dread. Justin was right, this wasn't over. The red and blue lights painted the room in sharp, alternating flashes, casting shadows that seemed to dance on the walls. Megan stood near the edge of the living room, arms crossed defensively, her phone clutched tightly in one hand. 2 officers stood between her and Justin, one older, with a stern and weathered face, and the other younger, still green with inexperience. The faint crackle of the fire outside was the only sound, steady and persistent like an unspoken accusation. Megan stepped forward, her voice shaky but firm. Officers, she said, tears brimming in her eyes. You have to help me. My husband has lost his mind. He burned all my belongings. He's threatening me, and I'm terrified of what he'll do next. Justin remained by the fireplace, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He didn't say a word, but his piercing gaze bore into Megan, daring her to continue. The younger officer turned to Megan, his expression cautious but curious. "Ma'am," he said, "we're here to help, but we need to understand what's going on. Can you explain why your husband would do something like this?" Megan nodded quickly, her tears spilling over as she spoke. "I don't know," she said, her voice rising. "He's been acting strange for weeks, paranoid and distant. Tonight I came home and he'd set all my belongings on fire. When I asked why, he just kept accusing me of things I didn't do." Justin finally moved, his jaw tightening as he turned to the older officer. "This is unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. The older officer raised a hand, his expression stern. "We'll hear both sides, Mr. Duncan." He turned back to Megan. "You said he accused you of things. What exactly did he accuse you of?" Megan hesitated, her eyes darting toward Justin before looking away. "He thinks," she took a shaky breath, "he thinks I've been unfaithful." Her voice broke, and she pressed a hand to her mouth, as though saying the words out loud hurt. "But it's not true. I would never do that to my family. I don't know what's gotten into him." Justin let out a sharp, bitter laugh, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "Not true," he echoed, his tone calm but dripping with venom. "That's quite the performance, Megan. But why don't you tell them the whole truth?" The younger officer frowned, glancing between the two of them as the tension thickened. The older officer turned to Justin, his expression firm. "Sir, if you have evidence to support your claims, now would be the time to share it." Justin nodded, his movements deliberate as he stepped toward the kitchen counter. He picked up his phone, swiping through it with precision. "I didn't want to involve Laura in this," he said, his voice softening just slightly. "But she came to me because she was scared. She saw things no child should ever see. And then, my wife threatened to send her to an orphanage if she told me." The older officer's eyes narrowed. "Is that true, ma'am?" Megan's face turned crimson, her voice rising in a desperate pitch. "No, that's a lie. I would never say something like that to Laura. He's twisting everything." Justin ignored her protests and held out his phone to the officers. "Here, listen for yourselves." He pressed play, and Laura's trembling, shaky voice filled the room. "I went into the bedroom and Mom was with a man. She told me I'd go to an orphanage if I told Dad." As the recording ended, the room fell into a suffocating silence, broken only by the faint hum of the phone. Megan's mouth opened and closed as though searching for words, but none came. Her arguments faltered under the weight of the evidence. The younger officer looked visibly uncomfortable, while the older officer's expression hardened into a steely glare. "Mrs. Duncan," the older officer said, his tone sharp, "do you have an explanation for this?" Megan's hands shook as she stammered. That's not what it sounds like. I was upset. Okay? I might have said something I didn't mean, but I wasn't serious. Laura misunderstood me." Justin's voice cut through her defense, low and controlled. "Laura didn't misunderstand. And neither will a court, Megan, if you keep lying." The officers exchanged a brief glance. The younger one stepped forward, his tone softer but still firm. "Ma'am, if there's more to this story, now's the time to share it. Otherwise, this recording doesn't reflect well on you." Megan's defenses crumbled under their scrutiny. Tears streamed down her face, and she shook her head. "It's not fair," she sobbed. "I made a mistake. But this is a setup. Justin is trying to make me look like a monster." Justin raised an eyebrow, his voice calm yet cutting. "A monster? No, Megan. I'm simply showing them who you really are." The older officer sighed heavily, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "Look, this isn't something the police are equipped to handle. This is a domestic dispute. From what I see, there's no immediate threat to either of you. We're not here to mediate your marriage." "But," Megan started, but the officer held up a hand to stop her. "Ma'am, if you feel unsafe, you can file for a protective order. But right now, this is something you need to handle like adults. Consult your lawyers. Take this to court if you have to. But this? Burning her belongings? It's not something we can act on unless things escalate further. Megan stared at the officers, her face a mixture of disbelief and anger. You're just going to leave? He destroyed everything I own. The older officer's steady gaze met hers. Ma'am, we've explained the situation. If you believe you're in danger, take the proper steps. Right now, there's no immediate threat. Justin crossed his arms, his expression blank. Thank you, officers. I'll take care of it from here. The officers nodded, their presence retreating as they stepped back toward their squad car. Megan stood frozen in place, her mind spinning. She couldn't believe they had left without taking action. She turned to Justin, fury burning in her eyes. This isn't over, she hissed. You've turned Laura against me, lied to the police, and destroyed my things. You're the one tearing this family apart. Justin stared at her with an eerie calm. No, Megan, he said evenly. You did that the moment you betrayed us. Now you have to live with the consequences. Megan's fists clenched, her mind racing for a way to turn the situation in her favor. But for now, she knew Justin had the upper hand. The next morning arrived with a dull, gray sky that threatened rain but never followed through. Justin sat at the kitchen table, a steaming mug of coffee in front of him, untouched. The faint smell of smoke lingered in the air, drifting in from the remains of Megan's belongings in the backyard. His thoughts felt as heavy as the overcast clouds outside. Laura's trembling voice from the recording echoed in his mind, the fear in her tone cutting him deeper than anything Megan had done. The creak of a door upstairs broke the silence. Slow, hesitant footsteps followed, each step dragging slightly on the stairs. Megan appeared in the doorway, her face pale, her eyes rimmed red from a sleepless night. For a moment, she hovered there, as if unsure whether to step inside. Justin, she said quietly, her voice tight and cautious, we need to talk. He didn't look at her, his eyes locked on his coffee mug as his fingers tightened around it. We've talked enough, he replied, his tone cold. Megan hesitated, then moved further into the room. She pulled out a chair and sat across from him, clasping her hands together as though trying to keep herself steady. I know you're angry, she began, her tone soft and pleading. And I know I've made mistakes, but we can't keep doing this. It's tearing us apart, and it's not good for Laura. At the mention of their daughter, Justin finally looked up. His eyes were sharp and unyielding, cutting into her like a blade. Don't, he said, his voice low but firm. Don't you dare try to play the concerned parent now. You scared her so badly she thought she couldn't come home. That's what's tearing this family apart. Tears welled up in Megan's eyes as she reached for his hand. He jerked it away before she could touch him. I didn't mean to hurt her, she said, her voice cracking. I was scared, Justin. I was afraid that if she told you, you'd leave. You'd take her away from me. Justin shook his head, disbelief etched into his features. So your solution was to threaten her? To make her think she'd lose both of us? What kind of mother does that? I panicked, Megan cried, her voice breaking under the weight of her own emotions. I wasn't thinking straight. I just didn't know what else to do. You could have told the truth, Justin snapped, his voice rising. You could have owned up to your mistakes instead of dragging our daughter into your lies. Megan's frustration boiled over, and she shot up from her chair, her voice shaking with anger. And what about you, Justin? Burning my things? Turning Laura against me? Acting like you've never made a mistake in your life. This isn't about me, Justin said coldly, his voice steady. This is about you and the choices you made. You're the one who betrayed this family, Megan. Not me. Megan's chair scraped loudly against the floor as she stood, her hands clenched into fists, her chest heaving with rage. Fine, she said through gritted teeth. Blame me. Make me the villain. But you're not taking Laura away from me. Justin stood slowly, his imposing frame towering over her. She's staying with me because she deserves stability, and you've proven you can't give her that. Megan's face crumpled, but she said nothing. With a frustrated cry, she spun around and stormed out of the kitchen, retreating to the guest room. The door slammed, followed by muffled words. She was on the phone, probably calling the man she had betrayed him with. Justin forced himself to stay seated, though anger churned inside him. He picked up his phone and called his lawyer, determined to gather everything he needed to protect Laura. This was far from over. Justin leaned back in his chair, closing his eyes briefly. The fight wasn't over, not even close, but he was determined to face whatever lay ahead for Laura's sake. She was his priority, his anchor, and he would do whatever it took to protect her. The days that followed were a whirlwind of phone calls, legal meetings, and constant preparation. Justin gathered every piece of evidence to show Megan's instability and betrayal, building a case that would ensure Laura's safety. Laura remained at Beatrix's house, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing around her. When Justin called to check in, her small, hesitant voice reminded him why he couldn't falter. He carried the weight of it all silently, unwilling to let her sense the chaos unfolding. Megan's visits to the house became sporadic. When she did return, the tension was suffocating. They avoided each other, only speaking when absolutely necessary, their exchanges brief and devoid of the warmth they once shared. It was the quiet before the inevitable storm, and Justin knew it. One late evening, as Justin sifted through court documents at the dining table, he heard the rumble of Megan's car pulling into the driveway. Glancing at the clock, he noted it was nearly midnight. She hadn't mentioned she'd be back, but her unpredictability no longer surprised him. The front door creaked open, and Megan stepped inside. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She lingered in the doorway, clutching her purse tightly. When their eyes met, the anger that had flared in their previous encounters was absent. Instead, she looked tired, broken. "We need to talk," she said quietly, her voice fragile. Justin placed his pen down and leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "Go ahead." Megan hesitated before setting her purse on the counter, her trembling fingers betraying her unease. "I don't want to fight anymore," she said, her voice wavering. This isn't what I wanted." Justin's eyes narrowed slightly. "What did you want, Megan? A family you could lie to? A husband who would ignore it all?" Tears filled Megan's eyes as she sank into a chair across from him. "I wanted to feel loved," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You were always so busy, with work, with Laura, with everything else. I felt invisible." Justin's chest tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "And your solution was to destroy the life we built? To betray me? To hurt Laura? I didn't mean for it to go this far," she said, her tears falling freely. "I didn't plan for any of this. It just happened." "That's not good enough, Megan," Justin said, his voice rising slightly. "Feeling neglected doesn't give you a free pass to ruin everything." Megan wiped at her tears, frustration flashing in her eyes. "You think I'm the only one at fault here? You were absent too, Justin. Always working late, always distracted. You think I didn't notice how distant you'd become?" Justin leaned forward, his gaze intense. "I worked late to provide for us, to give you and Laura the life you wanted. I trusted you, Megan. That was my mistake." Silence fell between them, heavy and oppressive. Megan eventually stood, her shoulders slumped as though all the fight had drained from her. "You've already made up your mind," she said softly. "No matter what I say, you'll never forgive me." Justin didn't respond. He watched her walk to the door, her steps slow and heavy. Just as she reached for the handle, she turned back to him. "I'll see you in court," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "And don't think for a second I won't fight for Laura." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Justin alone in the dim kitchen. He stared at the legal papers spread before him, his mind racing. Megan's words echoed, but he refused to let them sway him. This wasn't about their marriage anymore. It was about ensuring Laura's safety and well-being. The court date arrived on a dreary Monday morning, the sky thick with clouds that threatened rain. The courthouse was bustling with muted activity, the air filled with shuffling papers and hushed conversations. Justin sat at the plaintiff's table beside his lawyer, a binder of carefully prepared evidence in front of them. Across the room, Megan sat stiffly, her lawyer whispering in her ear. When the judge entered, the room fell silent, and the proceedings began. Each side presented their case. Justin's lawyer spoke with precision, methodically laying out the facts. The recording of Laura's confession played, her small, shaky voice echoing through the courtroom. Megan's lawyer objected, claiming it was out of context, but the judge allowed it to remain in evidence. Justin remained composed, even as Megan's lawyer attempted to portray him as controlling and emotionally distant. When it was Megan's turn to testify, her confidence faltered. Her explanations were weak, riddled with contradictions, and her attempts to justify her actions only seemed to deepen the judge's disapproval. Finally, Justin took the stand. He spoke with quiet conviction about his love for Laura and his commitment to providing her with a stable, safe home. He described the pain of betrayal and his concerns for Laura's emotional well-being. Every word was measured, sincere, and unwavering. When the judge delivered the ruling, Justin's heart raced. Per Megan, custody of the child, Laura Duncan, will be awarded to Mr. Justin Duncan. Mrs. Megan Duncan will have supervised visitation rights pending further evaluation. Relief washed over Justin, easing the tension that had gripped him for weeks. He glanced at Megan, who sat frozen in place, her face pale and stricken. Her lawyer leaned toward her, speaking in hushed tones, but she didn't respond. That evening, Justin picked Laura up from Beatrix's house. Her face lit up when she saw him, and she ran into his arms, her small voice bursting with joy. "I'm glad to be home, Dad." Justin held her tightly, his heart heavy yet resolute. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Laura's wounds would take time to heal, and their lives would need rebuilding. But they had a chance now, a fresh start. As they drove back to the house, Justin felt a bittersweet sense of peace. Their family would never be the same, but together, they would find a way forward. For Laura, he would endure anything.